Thank you for joining us on the channel. We hope you like and subscribe this video, subscribe to the channel. We are finishing up the book of Ruth, or not the book of Ruth, the first chapter of the book of Ruth. And I say that because if you're just joining the channel, this is not the first video on Ruth. It's not even the first or second video on the first chapter of Ruth. We're not going as deeply as you could go because, of course, we could take every verse and talk forever. But we're trying to spread this series of videos out to dive somewhat deeply into the book of Ruth. Sometimes these shorter books of the Bible, and I would even argue sometimes sort of the shorter narratives, books like Ruth and Esther, sometimes we just kind of rehearse the narrative very quickly, and that's kind of all we do. And so I hope by taking a little bit deeper dive that you're being encouraged by the things that we're doing here, and hope this is encouraging your Bible study. We'll be in Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 through 22 in just a moment. Before we do that, let me introduce this lesson just a little bit by reminding us that names mean things. We live in a culture, especially in American culture, where names are very often chosen more for sort of how they sound or maybe a family connection. But in a lot of cultures, especially ancient cultures, but even many modern cultures, people choose names of children based upon what a word means. You look at common last names like Smithson or Taylor. You see that influence from what the person used to do. In many Native American cultures, it was common to name someone for a character trait. And the Bible even places an emphasis on names. I mean, even God himself changed people's names at times in order to basically change the emphasis of someone's life. Think of Abram's name being changed to Abraham. And it was not totally uncommon for a child to not be named for some time, so that a trait could be attached to his or her name. Just think about Moses. We know him so well. We'll sometimes talk about the birth of Moses. Well, that's true in a way, but he wasn't named Moses for quite some time. Pharaoh's daughter is the one who names him. And he had been hidden in the river, or should be hidden in the house for several months, and then she found him in the river, and then he was given that name. So names mean something in Scripture, and we have to keep that in mind. Now, with that in mind, let's read the text, and we're going to see how names play a role in the ending of Ruth chapter 1. Beginning in verse 19 and going to the end of the chapter, just a handful of verses 19 through 22. So the two of them, that is Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara," or sometimes you hear it pronounced Mara, "for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So as this little section begins, these women go to Bethlehem. This is after Ruth's just beautiful statement of loyalty that we studied in the last video. The narrative of the book takes us back to the village of Bethlehem, which is where the book and, of course, chapter 1 had started. About a decade earlier, Naomi had left that village with her husband and two sons, due, as you recall, to famine and the difficulty that was causing. But now she's returning, but a whole lot of dynamics have changed. She's no longer married. Her husband has died. She does not have any living children any longer. Both her sons have died. But she's also not returning alone, as a Moabite woman is coming with her, a daughter-in-law. The name of Bethlehem, by the way, as we've said earlier in this series of videos, means house of bread. And the text tells us these two women, Naomi, Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. Now, it's doubtful that means they traveled literally nonstop, but it probably means they only stopped as might have been necessary to rest, eat, those sorts of things. They were ready to get to that village of Bethlehem because it was where they wanted to go, but also for two women to be traveling alone at that time was quite dangerous. Stopping for any unnecessary length of time could have been dangerous, if not disastrous. And while the journey is not documented for us in any detail, the narrative slows down when Naomi and Ruth come actually to the village of Bethlehem. It's as if the return is both exciting and confusing to, verse 19 says, the whole town. Now, that's likely some level of hyperbole, but it's possibly literal, because Bethlehem was a small village. An incoming pair of weary travelers, especially two women, would have been, for lack of a better term, local news. As these two arrive, The narrative specifically tells us that the women were asking about one they had known a decade earlier. Did you notice it? Is this Naomi? Verse 20. One commentator, by the way, suggests that this implies that the men were out at harvest and were not discussing the matter in any detail. Leon Morris says that in his commentary. Well, that's possible, and of course it makes some sense. It's also possible that women simply notice this woman and recognize her before the men do, despite the weariness of the past decades showing on her face and form. In other words, it's possible these women simply notice and show a closer concern before the men take notice. We kind of see that in our culture from time to time now, don't we? But either way, they still ask, is this Naomi? You can almost sense how this question starts in the marketplace or maybe sort of some windows, but the women are also excited by these visitors, and so they come out to greet these two women. And as they do, it's either they don't know for certain if the older woman is Naomi, or they're asking the question this way kind of to be nice and friendly. After all, again, Leon Morris writes this, quote, years had passed since she had lived there, and those years had dealt harshly with her. It would not be surprising, accordingly, if she was sufficiently altered in appearance to make such a question appropriate, end quote. Now, it's very human to read Naomi's response. Earlier, even though times had been a real struggle, she had stayed true to God, had even helped Ruth come closer to him, but now she just vents out of frustration and sadness. If you've never felt that roller coaster of emotions, even by the way toward God, then you really just haven't lived through very many experiences. And at this point, Naomi lets things out that are almost shocking to read. First, she doesn't want to be called by her actual name. The name Naomi means pleasant. But instead, she tells the woman to call her the name Mara or Marah, which is a term that means bitter. Now, we don't know if she meant that to be the name she preferred for the rest of her life, or if she meant this more as sort of a nickname in the moment. But whichever it was, Naomi was expressing how she feels in a very strong and a very personal way. But Naomi does not just claim she feels better. Instead, she states that she had been dealt a bitter lot in life, and that by God himself. Her words, reflect what so many people feel when they're hurting, when they basically say, God has done this. Now, we know that God allows certain things to happen, but God is not the cause of our distress and our suffering. But still, it can be very easy to be like Naomi and feel as if God himself has just struck us with something bad. And it's at this point that the reader of Ruth can either identify with Naomi or almost kind of shun her. Now, personally, I think it's wiser to admit that we identify with her, whether we want to do so or not. I want to read to you a quote that's a little bit longer than what I usually do on these videos, but I think it says it very well. It's written by a man named Steve Zeisler, and he said, I don't know very many people who would quickly rise above the standard set by Naomi in these verses. When we are dealt very painful circumstances in life, we can usually take the first blow and maybe even a second. But when we are pounded and pounded again and again by setbacks, disappointments, losses, and griefs, when our painful circumstances settle in and cause us agony that lasts day after day, year after year, most of us tend to respond as Naomi did, if not worse. We become embittered, hard, faithless. We develop a hard shell, and we retreat within it, end quote. But here's the thing. Naomi isn't done. As she continues to speak, she gives a further reason why she wants to be called by this name or nickname, Mara, and it's because she says, the Almighty has brought me back empty. Now read those words again. Read them slowly, and think for a moment. Now, have things been awful for Naomi? Absolutely. But how would you have liked to have been Ruth and heard her say that? Ruth is not her husband. Ruth is not a son. But for Naomi to say she's come back empty could have cut like a knife. And it's a reminder that when we grieve or go through times of tremendous strain, we will often say things that either we don't mean or that come out harshly. We may mean them in the moment, but we may not mean them in exactly the way they come across. But still, these words from Naomi are a reminder that she really is feeling Mara. She really is feeling bitter. And still further, Naomi, or Mara, continues to blame God for all of this. Not only has he brought her back home empty, as she says, but she states that God has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. Now, exactly what she thinks is being testified about is never stated. But in the throes of grief and pain, often it doesn't matter. For Naomi in the moment, perception is reality. She feels as if she's done something wrong or been judged to have come up short, and so God has brought all this calamity in her life. And by the way, the word translated calamity is a very strong word. The King James Version, I think some others have the word afflicted. The word comes from a root term that literally carries the idea of being broken in pieces. And it was broadly used to describe things that were both physically or psychologically hard, or things that were truly evil. But Naomi is using it here to basically say that God has crushed her to pieces through what she thinks he has done to her. And it's significant that twice in this response, once in verse 20 and once in verse 21, Naomi refers to God as the Almighty. Now, that was a very common way of referring to Jehovah God, but to do so in this speech is very telling. Naomi sees herself rightly as weak, but she also feels as if God has used his almighty power completely against her, and now she is crushed because of it. Now, earlier, we said this section shows the humanness of Naomi, and that's true. Just a short while before these events, Naomi had helped Ruth come to a greater understanding of God, and Ruth was touched enough to even pledge loyalty to Jehovah. Your God will be my God. And now Naomi's lashing out and blaming the very same God in very strong ways for the difficulties she's faced for the past few years and where her life is now compared to where it was, let's say, a decade or so earlier. And while I don't believe we should hold Naomi up as some type of perfect example because she did this, I do think we can see ourselves in her. While we know we should trust God at all times, there are situations and there are seasons of life we might find ourselves sort of lashing out at him for not hearing or not caring or even seemingly being vindictive against us. And by the way, Naomi is not the only person in Scripture who did this. If you don't believe me, spend some serious time in the book of Psalms. A good number of those times, the poets, which of course include David, will cry out to God and will either blame him for a situation or will wonder why God is not dealing with something that's crushing their spirit. Here's just a short sampling. Psalm 6 verse 1. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Psalm 10 verse 1. Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And Psalm 13 verse 1. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? And if you've read the Psalms, you know there are many others. The key is to remember that these poems in Psalms typically ended with statements of trust, even though they were penned in times of confusion and frustration. Naomi's story will end the same way, but in this moment at the end of Ruth chapter 1, she cannot see that, and she lashes out as we all likely have at one time. One writer said, the good news of the book of Ruth is that God does not leave Naomi in her bitterness. When people are frustrated and angry, and they pray with their fists clenched at God, when they scream and struggle against life, God does not toss them aside. In fact, when you read the stories of people such as Jacob and Job and Naomi and Peter and Paul, you almost get the feeling that God has a special place in his heart for such people. As we shall see, Naomi is going to be changed, but not without a struggle, end quote. Now, the picture we have at the end of Ruth chapter 1 of Naomi and Ruth coming into the village is not exactly a triumphal return. Here are two women who have lost basically everything, one of whom is extremely bitter even toward God. But chapter 1 ends with a subtle note, not just of literary foreshadowing, but of the providence of God. As one writer calls it, a glimmering of hope. The last line of verse 22 simply states, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Let that sink in for a moment. These two weary widows just happened to return, one, after God had blessed the land with abundance, two, at the very beginning of the time, not at the end, where that abundance could be taken advantage of, and three, to a land that had laws in place for taking care of widows in these specific situations. Their return, which likely was at the end of what we know as the month of April, just happened to be at the right time, at the right place, for their safety and their well-being. Oh, and to add to the timing, wheat was typically harvested only about a month later. So there would be more safety and more security to come. God was already there. Naomi may have been bitter, but God was already working, as we sometimes say, behind the scenes to care for her and loyal Ruth in the house of bread, Bethlehem. Listen to one commentator, quote, "Now, Moabites most definitely did not possess most favored nation status with Israel. Still, under the stipulation of the Mosaic law, they, along with other aliens living among the Jews, were given the right to gather the grain in the corners of the fields, as well as whatever else was overlooked by the reapers, Deuteronomy 24:19, Leviticus 19:9. So in a very real sense, the Lord had scripturally and providentially pre-planned to meet the pressing needs of Ruth and Naomi," end quote. And so I end this video by saying, if you're in a place of grief and bitterness, be very careful. While you'll likely not think straight, and understandably so, don't let your bitterness blind you to the reality of God and what He has done for you. You may be ready to blame Him, but don't forget, He's already in tomorrow. He's ready to bless us if we will accept His blessing. I hope that you have enjoyed the study of Ruth chapter 1. We will dive into Ruth chapter 2. And I'll go ahead and tell you, chapters 2 and 3, we'll take it a little bit more rapid pace as we go through. Not because there's not much there, because chapter 1 sets so much of the scene that we can begin to move a little more quickly. And so we hope that you will subscribe to the channel, like the video, let us know about it, and hope you'll be back with us for the next study of the book of Ruth. Thanks for watching.